Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that we all do, like every day, right? We classify and categorize people. It's kind of how we as humans, make sense of this big, crazy
Oh,
world.
yeah, for sure. You hit the nail on the head. Like, our brains, they just love to find patterns and order. And one of the main tools we use for that is classification.
Right.
But it gets really interesting when we apply that to something as complex as like human diversity. The results can be kind of surprising.
Yeah, totally. So that's what we're going to be diving into today. And we're calling this the paradox of diversity exposure
Uh-huh.
and the dual edge of classification.
Interesting.
And we'll be pulling from some of our research and notes for this. And our goal today is to kind of understand the reasons why we categorize things and how that impacts how we see diversity
Okay.
and the role that power plays in these systems.
Fascinating.
Now, have you ever noticed how sometimes, when you're around more diverse groups of people, it can actually make everyone seem more similar,
Yeah.
not less? Or like how the labels we use to describe people can both help us understand each other
Right.
and at the same time create new problems.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, we'll be diving into all of that and more.
Let's start with that first idea you just mentioned.
Okay.
The paradox of diversity exposure. So our research is highlighting this fascinating idea. It says that increased exposure to diverse environments can actually lead to a decrease in something called stereotype dispersion.
Okay.
So basically making groups seem more similar, not less.
Huh. It seems kind of counterintuitive, though, right? Like you'd think the more interaction you have, the more you would notice differences between people.
Yeah, you'd think so. But research suggests that having more diversity around you can actually challenge and reshape those existing mental categories in your mind. So the more we interact with people from different backgrounds and we do it genuinely, the less we rely on those broad stereotypes.
Gotcha. So instead of defaulting to this general idea you have about a group, you start to see the actual person.
Exactly. You start to see the person as an individual. And a really important point here is that increased contact with people from diverse backgrounds can reveal some unexpected commonalities.
Hmm.
So when we're spending time with people that, might look different from us or come from a different background, you start to notice these like shared experiences, shared values and goals that you might not have expected. And this can lead to a perception of similarity even when there are obvious differences on the surface.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's not just about recognizing someone as an individual, it's also about recognizing our shared humanity.
So it's almost like if you only have superficial exposure to
Mhm.
people, then those stereotypes tend to stay in place.
Hmm.
But when you really interact with people who are different from you, then you start to see the commonalities, the shared humanity, and the stereotypes break down.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay, well, let's shift gears a little bit
Right?
to this dual edge of classification.
Okay.
Our notes were talking about how classification both simplifies and misrepresents diversity. So let's tackle simplification first.
Okay.
Why is it that we as humans even feel this urge to classify things?
It's a kind of a very basic need. Our brains are taking in a ton of information every second of the day, and classifying is the way that we try to make sense of all the complexity.
Yeah, I can imagine.
You're not just talking about people here. We do this with objects and concepts and everything. It's just a basic organization principle for the mind.
It's like creating mental shortcuts
Yeah, mental shortcuts.
just to help you manage all of the data that's coming in.
Exactly. So we're making these shortcuts, and that lets us make quick judgments when we're facing, a bunch of new information. Like we're trying to process it quickly.
Okay, so I get the need for that.
Hmm.
But how does this become a misrepresentation?
Well, the impulse to simplify is natural. But what often happens is we oversimplify things.
Okay.
And that especially happens with human diversity. So we start putting people into these neat little categories, and we risk missing out on all the things that make them unique, because no category can ever fully capture the complexity of a human being.
It's like you're taking this really colorful, vibrant painting, and you're trying to describe it by listing out the four primary colors that were used.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It just doesn't do it justice.
And there was something in our notes about a typological approach being discredited in modern science. What was that all about?
Oh, yeah, the typological approach, yeah, that was this older scientific method that they would use to try and put people into these fixed categories. And it was all based on really observable traits, almost like they were trying to create these, like, types of humans.
Hmm.
But modern science has moved away from that approach because it's just, like, fundamentally flawed, right?
Yeah.
It's way too simple, and as our notes pointed out, there's just a huge potential for misuse.
I see.
And it can lead to, really harmful stereotypes and discrimination. It just doesn't account for the wide range of human variation that you see within any group.
So it's like it's way too rigid of a system,
Yeah.
and it doesn't account for the fact that people and identities are so fluid,
Yeah.
right?
Uh-huh.
And then on top of that,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like a lot of these pre-established categories come with baggage.
Yeah.
Like implicit assumptions and power relations baked in. What can you tell me about that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The categories we use to talk about diversity, even in our everyday lives, they're not neutral. They carry these hidden assumptions and they reflect the power dynamics that are already present in society. For example, when you categorize people as women in organizational studies, that can sometimes be associated with disadvantages that women face. Or it's associated with the need to create specific interventions, to help them overcome these disadvantages.
Right.
And that can end up reinforcing biases rather than just describing a group.
Wow.
Or like another example, if you label someone as a Somali immigrant, that can immediately bring to mind all these preconceived notions about their labor market status or their cultural norms,
Yeah.
which might not be accurate at all for that individual person.
Wow. So the category itself can carry all of these unspoken assumptions.
Yes, exactly. And this is where you can see the power dynamics at play, right?
Yeah.
Because whoever has the power to define these categories, they get to decide which differences actually matter
Right.
and what the norms are for those categories.
And of course, that leads to the marginalization of people who don't fit neatly into those categories.
Yes, exactly. So their experiences and their perspectives, they're often overlooked or they're seen as less relevant simply because they don't fit into the box that was already created.
It's like you made a mold for a square, and everyone else has to try to squeeze themselves into that square shape, even if they're a circle or a triangle.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And it's not just these long-standing categories, it's also these emergent categories. The ones that our notes mention, these new categories that pop up. Even they are not immune to the influences of power.
So even when we're trying to be more inclusive and create more flexible categories, we have to be careful because we might still be accidentally reinforcing those same inequalities if we're not paying attention.
Yes, exactly. We have to be very vigilant. Because even when our intentions are good, the outcome can still be bad if we're not careful about who's involved in defining those categories and what assumptions are baked in. So even though you might be trying to create something new and fair, the foundation might still be off.
It's like building a new house on top of a cracked foundation.
Yeah, exactly.
So by just emphasizing group membership through these classifications, even if our heart is in the right place, we run the risk of reinforcing stereotypes and preventing people from truly understanding each other as individuals.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The simplification that classification gives us, it can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can give us a basic understanding of something, but on the other hand, it can come at the cost of accuracy.
Yeah.
And it can actually perpetuate those harmful biases.
This leads us to the role of power in these systems.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's not just a neutral way of organizing info. It's actually very much intertwined with, who has the power in a society.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. As we've seen, the act of categorization itself, it's linked to these power structures.
Right.
Because those in power, they have the ability to define what the categories are. They decide what is normal, and they get to say what differences are important.
And we've seen some really clear examples of this throughout history, right?
Yeah.
Like our notes were mentioning how classification systems have been used to create and maintain social hierarchies.
Yeah, for sure. Think about historical racial classifications.
Yeah.
Those were often used to justify discrimination and reinforce those existing power structures, and even to deny basic human rights to certain groups of people. And sadly, those classifications that were rooted in power imbalances, they've had a long and damaging legacy.
Yeah.
They're still shaping how we see and categorize human diversity even today.
It's like the ghosts of those systems are still here with us.
They really are. They've just become a part of our social structures and our personal beliefs.
Yeah.
And they just perpetuate those power dynamics from the past.
So it's not just these neutral words that we're using. It's actually carrying all this weight from the past.
Yeah.
All of these struggles for power that have happened.
Yes. And as we were saying earlier, these categories often carry assumptions that reflect power relations. Like the examples that we talked about before about women or Somali immigrants. They show how those power dynamics are still at play in our modern classification systems. The ability to define and name things, That is a very powerful ability.
Yeah.
And even when we're trying to be more inclusive with these new emergent categories, we still have to be mindful of the underlying power dynamics because they could still be shaping our thinking.
Yeah. It's a very difficult problem.
It really is. You know, the desire to be more inclusive is great, but it's just not enough.
Right.
We have to really look at who is creating these categories
Yeah.
and whose voices are being heard.
Right.
Are we just replicating the same power imbalances in some new fancy way? Creating classification systems, it's almost never a neutral thing.
Right.
It's influenced by those in power, and unfortunately, that can lead to marginalizing groups that have less power, even if that's not what anyone intends.
That's a very tricky thing to navigate.
It is. It requires constant awareness.
Yeah. This is a really complex issue.
Yeah. It
What
really,
this natural human tendency to try to put things into categories, as a way of making sense of things. But the way we do that is shaped by all these social forces and all this history, right?
Right.
And all of that has a huge impact on how we understand diversity. So let's try to put all of that together, all these cognitive, social, and historical impacts of classification.
Okay. So on one hand, we have this cognitive process, this inherent drive to put things in categories to simplify.
Yeah.
It's just how our brains work to try and make sense of things efficiently.
Right.
But this isn't happening in a vacuum.
Yeah.
The way that we understand these categories, the specific categories that we use, they're all shaped by our social and historical context.
Right.
It's a constant interplay between how our brain is wired and the world around us.
And these historical classification systems, the ones based on race,
Right.
those weren't just abstract ideas. They were actually used to create these hierarchies
Right.
and to justify inequalities.
Yeah, they were used to validate those social hierarchies.
Right.
They were used to distribute power in a way that was unequal. And unfortunately, they were used to maintain discriminatory practices.
And over time, these classifications became deeply ingrained in our society.
Yeah,
And they influenced everything.
they did. Everything from institutions to our own personal beliefs about the world.
Right.
And it really highlights how categorization and power structures are just so closely linked.
Right.
Because those who get to define the categories, they can perpetuate inequalities without even realizing it. They get to decide what's normal, and everyone else is judged against that standard. And it just keeps going. It's a cycle.
And then you have these pre-established categories.
Right.
Like when we talk about women or certain ethnic groups, they come preloaded with all of these historical associations and power relations.
Yeah, and they reinforce stereotypes and make it harder for us to really see each other as individuals. Classifying can be useful in some situations, but we have to remember that it always involves simplification. And simplification can become oversimplification, which can lead to stereotyping and then eventually discrimination.
Yeah, and then we have this typological approach, which, fortunately was discredited.
Right.
But it shows the dangers of what happens when you try to rigidly categorize people.
Yeah.
You're basically treating human beings like they're just specimens in a museum.
Yeah.
So these systems that we've created, these categories, they really have a huge influence on how we perceive diversity in the first place.
Yeah.
If our categories are too narrow, then our understanding of humanity is going to be very limited.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to note that diversity exposure itself can have this weird effect where it makes people seem more similar. And in a way, that's our brain trying to make sense of this new information by creating new categories.
It's like our brain is scrambling to catch up with our lived experiences.
Yeah, it's this dynamic process between our need to categorize and what we're actually experiencing in the world.
And there seems to be a move away from these traditional, often problematic categories. Our notes mention these emerging categories that are much more context-dependent, and they focus more on power dynamics.
Yeah, a lot of people are advocating for that kind of shift,
Yeah.
Towards categories that are more specific to the situation.
Right.
And that really consider the power dynamics that are at play. But we also have to remember that even these emergent categories can still be influenced by those existing power structures.
Right. It's something to constantly be mindful of.
Yeah, we have to constantly be questioning these frameworks that we're using.
So the question becomes, how do we create new systems, new categories
Yeah.
that don't just perpetuate the inequalities of the past?
It's a crucial question, and a lot of people are thinking about it. And it looks like the solution is going to involve technical safeguards and some fundamental structural reforms.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. What would some of those technical safeguards look like? especially when we're talking about machine learning.
Well, in machine learning, we're using algorithms more and more to make decisions about people.
Right.
So there are a few approaches to prevent those algorithms from being biased.
Okay.
So one set of techniques focuses on something called bias-aware algorithm design. And this involves doing things like pre-processing the data that the algorithm learns from. So for example, there's a technique called learning fair representation. And it basically tries to transform the data so that you remove information about protected attributes like race or gender, but you keep all the other information that's relevant for the task. It's kind of like you're redacting sensitive information from a document, but you're keeping the meaning intact.
I see. So you're basically teaching the algorithm to not be biased.
Right. And then there are in-processing methods like adversarial learning.
Yeah.
And that one actually trains the model to ignore those protected characteristics while it's learning, like you're teaching it to be colorblind in a certain way.
Gotcha.
And then you have these post-processing techniques like the randomized threshold optimizer, and that adjusts the model's output after it's done training so that you can try to achieve statistical parity across different groups.
Okay, so you're making adjustments after the algorithm has already learned. So all of these are ways of trying to build fairness into the algorithms themselves. But what about transparency? How do we make sure that these systems are actually fair?
Yeah, transparency is huge when it comes to accountability. And this involves requiring things like algorithmic audits, especially for systems that are used in really important areas like hiring. It's basically having an outside expert come in and make sure that the system is fair.
Okay.
And there's also this push for companies to disclose how protected attributes might be influencing those automated decisions.
So basically you're trying to make the black box of algorithms a little bit more see-through.
Exactly. So that's a technical side. But then we have the structural interventions, and that's about changing the wider context that these systems operate in.
Okay, so what kind of changes are we talking about there?
Well, this involves updating policies.
Okay.
So, for example, explicitly adding emerging categories like caste to anti-discrimination policies, while making it clear that the nature of discrimination can be different from other categories like religion.
I see.
And then there's participatory design, which is about getting people who are from marginalized communities to be part of the process of defining what diversity should even look like.
Yeah, that sounds really important because it makes sure that the way we're measuring diversity is actually aligned with the lived experiences of the people that are impacted by it.
Exactly. It's about bringing more voices to the table.
And making sure that everyone's perspective is included.
Yeah, and finally, there's this idea of critical consciousness training
Okay.
for the people who are designing these systems. So we're talking about the HR teams, the developers, the policymakers, and so on. And this type of training is about raising awareness of these invisible inequalities so that they can address them in these systems.
So it's not just about fixing the code, it's also about shifting the way people think.
Exactly. And then there's also this really important part, which is the monitoring and adaptation phase,
Okay.
because we have to make sure these systems are actually working.
Right.
So we have to track intersectional outcomes. So recognizing that people can belong to multiple groups.
Yeah.
And they might experience very specific forms of disadvantage.
Right.
And we have to use what are called dynamic fairness metrics,
Okay.
which basically means that as our understanding of inequality evolves, the metrics that we use to measure fairness, they have to evolve as well.
Gotcha. So it's not just a one-time fix.
No, it's not. It's this ongoing process.
Yeah.
We also need to have rapid response mechanisms,
Yeah.
just in case the technology is actually causing harm.
So it's about taking a multifaceted approach,
Mm.
addressing these historical inequities, preventing new harms from happening,
Right.
recognizing that identities are complex.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it's an ongoing process, right? We have to constantly reassess our understanding of all this.
Yes, exactly. It's this ongoing commitment to creating a more equitable way of seeing the world.
Wow, well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive
It has.
into a very complex topic. So let's just recap a little bit of what we talked about.
Hmm.
We've explored this tension that we have between our human desire to categorize everything
Uh-huh.
and the fact that human diversity is so incredibly nuanced.
Right.
We talked about how being exposed to more diversity can actually make people seem more similar to us,
Right.
which was really counterintuitive.
Yeah, it is.
We talked about the role of power
Mm.
and how we create these categories and how power imbalances can be baked into these seemingly neutral systems.
Yes.
And we've touched upon some of the new thinking about how to create more equitable ways of categorizing people and understanding each other.
Hopefully this deep dive has given you some things to think about, some
Yeah.
food for thought.
And maybe you've had some aha moments along the way
Yeah.
as you've been listening.
And you've come away with a more nuanced view of, this really fundamental part of being human,
Yeah.
how we understand the world around us. And this is really crucial for navigating a world that is becoming increasingly diverse.
So given everything we've discussed today, here's something I want you to think about. What are some everyday categories that you encounter that might actually be hiding a lot of complexity? And if you really think about the power dynamics behind those categories, how might that change the way you see the world?
That's a great question.
Well, that's all the time we have for today.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.